Organizations tend to spend a lot of money on training will only really benefit 22% of these individuals. While Gen Z, for instance, prefer to be at home, they were less productive than Gen X, and they were less productive than millennials. How would you expect to get more out of your staff if you don't understand why?
Welcome back to External Leadership Podcast. My name is Dagmara Asbreuk. I'm your host and transformational partner to CEOs and executives. And today we are going to dive into an important topic for every organization. And it is about employee productivity that obviously drives organizational performance. And in the studio, I have with me a person that's dedicated himself to find answers to this exact question, who has spent over 30 years in leading teams and in organizations, and who has developed also a model that we are going to explore that is called CARS, that is data-driven, low-cost, and high-impact tool that help leaders understand employees more holistically and make smarter developmental decisions. So I have an honor and pleasure to welcome Dr. Neil Katz with me today in this episodes, and together we are going to dive into this very important conversation. Neil, pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you, Dagmar. It's a pleasure to see you again and to speak with you again, as always.
Thank you very much. And Neil, I know that you have so much experience and, you've lived this, you breathe it. And something actually must have been a moment in your career that you said, okay, I want to discover more because something doesn't add up. There is something missing here in this whole topic. Tell us more about, when was that? What was the context? And, how did you actually started about this topic?
Sure. It goes back a long time ago. When I was in my early 20s, I was a musician. I was in a band, and I did not take my 9 to 5 job very seriously. I always did it as best I can do, did a good job, wanted to perform well and add value, but I didn't take the function that I was performing within the organization very seriously. I thought I was going to be a rock star. I thought I was going to be a musician. And after a few years, me and my wife had a child, and that was the catalyst that forced me to pay more attention to my 9 to 5 job, my job that was earning me money. And that was it. I started paying more attention to the decisions that were being made. I started paying more attention to how things operated. And to use a corny phrase, I dedicated myself and was more committed to the organization. So commitment, that was the first time I really thought about commitment to an organization. And that was really the catalyst that changed my approach, because over a shorter period of time, I went to get my MBA. I dedicated myself to work, got my promotion, started building teams and making decisions on my own and wondering, well, if I'm making these kinds of decisions, but I see the organization making those other kinds of decisions, is that incongruous, or how do I work towards providing the value if my thoughts and my decisions aren't exactly the same as the organization's? So that was sort of how that played out. And over another period of time, I was meeting with a COO who said to me, they're looking to change their culture within the firm to attract and retain millennials. This is when it was a big thing, when millennials were first coming into the organizational world, the work world, and they were perceived as being entitled and not really dedicated individuals, wanting breaks, and more importantly, they were looking for ping pong table and the bar taps in their organizations, which really wasn't true. I mean, maybe to a small extent it was. So my answer to that individual was, why would you do that? I don't understand. There's no empirical evidence that would prove that you'll be able to attract and retain these individuals. And that's when the light bulb went off in my mind to say, well, I'd love to do research on this topic. So not too long after that, a CEO came to me and said, well, not just to me, but to a number of people, and said, well, we're not looking to increase our staff for the coming year, but we're not looking to reduce staff either. What we're looking to do is get more out of our staff. So again, I reached out to that CEO and said, well, how would you expect to get more out of your staff if you don't understand why you're not currently getting more out of your staff? And within a year, I was in a doctoral program doing my own research that led to a model that I created that will help organizations identify the why around why aren't employees meeting or exceeding productivity expectations. That's sort of a short version, condensed version of what got me to where I.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I like the curiosity that you bring. So that light bulb that you mentioned, that actually was this ignition. I want to go deeper. I want to understand. And of course, very naturally comes the next question. What did you discover about the why?
So that's a great question. And when I first started my academic life, I was a psychology major, right? I went to university, got my degree in psychology, thinking, oh, I'm going to, and I told my wife this, you're going to marry a doctor and I will, I will heal people. That was my goal. Well, life takes its turns and did not pursue that, but was always interested throughout my professional career in what made employees tick, what drove them to being the employees that they could be. And when I started my studies later in life, I basically thought back to the psychology and the psychological part of it and focused on organizational behavior, right? So whether it's motivation or conscientiousness or whatever other variables it might be, that's what I was honing in on, in addition to leadership and how leadership plays into the organizational behavior. So I tried to marry those two things together to come up with reasons why individuals are not performing, producing in the manner in which they can. So yeah, I go back to my old psychology days, and what I had found is very interesting. So there are a number of variables around motivation, job satisfaction, commitment, engagement, etc. There are several. We look at complacency and burnout. And how do all of those things in combination with leadership, because that is a critical part of this, how does that play into the overall productivity? And the results in some instances were very obvious, but in other instances, not so much. So, for example, lots of studies have proven that more engaged individuals, more engaged employees will be more productive. That's not revolutionary, quite frankly. More committed individuals to the organization will be more productive. More conscientious individuals will be more productive. Not revolutionary. However, what became revolutionary was fostered by COVID and the pandemic, where individuals were now working in the office, some were working at home, and some were working as a mix between the office and home. And how did those elements play into the level of productivity and the level of engagement and the level of commitment to the organization? So those findings were actually very much more interesting to me than the single correlations between engagement and productivity, for example. So what I found was that generationally, millennials prefer to be in a hybrid situation. Gen Z preferred to be home, and Gen X and baby boomers prefer to be in the office. And
I could imagine that. I was listening, like, can I guess those? Yes.
yeah, no,
Yeah, yeah.
and
And then we have this generational gap, right?
and that's an important distinction because the engagement level of someone who is working from home is much different than the engagement level of someone who's in the office. Access to resources, access to leaders, access to various components of what they will need throughout the day is very different when they're in the office versus when they're home, or even hybrid, in the office a couple of days a week or maybe just a couple of days a month. So the findings there were also really interesting in that while Gen Z, for instance, prefer to be at home, they were less productive than Gen X, and they were less productive than millennials. So the study I conducted tried to correlate levels of productivity to work location, to leadership, and generational, differences as well. And it was really interesting, and that's what helped me drive the model. So my model also takes into consideration work location. It takes into consideration tenure and the amount of time in a role as opposed to on the job itself, working 20 years, 30 years, but in your current role for maybe 3 or 4. So it takes all of that into consideration when thinking about not just productivity, but burnout and complacency and motivation and things of that nature.
Yeah, so interesting um, which directions you have kind of used to explore and how your previous background was here supporting it. And yeah, interesting already. This is very interesting for listeners to hear about the preferences of generations, because that automatically makes you think, okay, one size fits all will not work. So we need to be more agile as an organization, more flexible as an organization, and also that actually helps enormously a leader to know why. Like one of the reasons why it could be, and of course, I would say that this other generational preferences, but then of course we need to talk with employees and understand them as individuals as well, and there will be also nuances. What else would you? Because that's very interesting. What else would you say are those areas that you notice made the difference on productivity, like the generational aspect of who want to work from home or not? What else could we a little bit enlighten leaders here today with?
So, in addition to like generational elements, it's also important to note that experience and time on the job plays into and levels of education as well. But this is mostly true depending on the organization and the role that the individual has. So, if an individual is more corporate with experience, they can be more productive in a role than maybe someone who doesn't have that type of experience. So what I try to study is a cross section of individuals across various industries. Now, that work is still going on, but what I have found is that individuals in the corporate world actually, from a productivity perspective, are less productive based on certain measures than individuals that are more blue collar, right? So, and I don't necessarily mean someone who's working on an assembly line, but someone who may be working outdoors in a field like transportation or construction or things of that nature. Um, the initial insights that I'm finding is that it's not all about education. It's not all about income level. When you look at organizations in a vacuum, then the answer to that would be yes. You do need to concern yourself with that level of demographic information, but it really is dependent upon the type of organization or industry that is being looked at or studied.
Also interesting. I'm curious to hear because looking from my lens or thinking from my perspective into this whole topic. Of course, I always think about those factors that drives human behaviors beneath the surface, the invisible factors, right? Which somehow wired in our human architecture or whichever we want to call it, the system, and who we really are on the deepest level. I'm curious to hear if in your research there has been anything in that nature also that was being revealed, or maybe that was not part of scope because we need to choose our dimension as well. So curious to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, so what I found interesting is when I first conducted my study, I was looking at personality types initially, and the personality type I was most interested in looking at was extroverts, thinking that an extrovert would want to be more engaged. An extrovert would be, more prone to being more productive than others. But I quickly shifted based on conversations I've had, based on guidance and advice I was given, and this all happened through my studies, to conscientiousness. So I moved from extroversion to conscientiousness, and that seemed to be a much more a factor that drove the productivity scale further and was more insightful than extroversion. I didn't do enough research to tell you the nuances as to why, but what I can tell you is that my initial study, extroversion, yielded different results than the output I got from studying conscientiousness. I can't say better or worse, but definitely different. And it leads me to believe that of the big five personality types, if they are studied in a vacuum along with the other variables, then the differences of extroversion versus introversion versus neuroticism, etc., will yield different results. And I'm not sure at the moment whether that's a critical factor to study. It's probably something I will look into as So when you write a doctoral dissertation, you talk about what are the things you're going to do in future studies. So that was one of the items that I put as a future study element. I haven't gotten around to it yet, though, but I do foresee there being very different results depending on the personality type, just from the two high level personalities that I did study.
Yeah. And personalities will always influence. I mean, just thinking about, it's then a whole completely different lens of looking at a human being because, and we need to also, I think, understand of if the personality style can actually evolve or not. Because, initially, and I have those beautiful psychometric tests when I work with leaders and, I can bring it as well on it helps human beings to understand himself, herself. At the same time, in growing into the transformational work, which is on a deeper level of human understanding, how identity evolves, how beliefs evolve, how everything we can actually evolve. It's who we are. I came to the conclusion that the personality styles is good to understand, but we cannot box ourselves into that. And there are personality styles and there are different, like you mentioned, extrovert, introvert is part of one lens on personalities. Another is, for example, using DISC, another is MBTI and so on. That is also fascinating to see how certain things can evolve just by how we can evolve intentionally, if we choose to, of course, evolve, and how that obviously show up in behaviors and decisions in speed. And I would also, listening to you, just what comes to my mind is the perspective that, the personality needs to be evaluated to the type of the role, right? And the type of the environment. Because we need a different type of human being for different part of environments. It's same as for leaders, right? Sometimes organization need more of driven or decisive leaders, and the others look more visionary leaders, right? And sometimes more data driven. Obviously, every leader ideally becomes, I call it, a bit more expanded in the way of how leader leads, right? But there's always an essence, right? There isn't always a core from which the leader or any employee, right, is also performing and leading from. So I think those factors also are very contextual, right? And interesting for organizations to look at
Yeah,
as a factor.
yeah. In addition to personality, one thing that I'm a big proponent of is employee needs. And this all plays into leadership types and leadership styles as well. Explain how I view that. So back in the 1950s, Maslow created this employee need hierarchy, but it was looked at very basically, right? The basic breathing and safety and, food and things of that nature. But in the 60s, this guy McClelland came up with the employee needs version that includes the need for achievement, the need for affiliation, and the need for power. Shortly after that, the need for autonomy came in as well. But in my opinion, employee needs, as well as all the other factors that I've been talking about, is critical. And it's critical from a leader perspective, in my opinion, just as you were mentioning that personalities, leaders, they're going to hopefully be driven based on the individuals that they are leading, right? So if I have a need for affiliation and my colleague has a need for power, our leader should be looking at us not necessarily differently, right? We have the same goals, right? That we need to produce, we need to perform, do what we need to do. But the way in which that leader will get the most out of me as an employee will be perhaps different than that leader will get this as much out of my colleague who has a different need. And it's this element that I also incorporated into my overall model because leadership, I mean, is critical, right? And I consider myself a contingent leader. I build teams while I have my own style per se, and whether you can call it, authentic or charismatic or any of the numerous types of leadership. I consider myself a contingency leader in that I will try to mold the way in which I work with someone to be in a manner in which I can get the most out of them. And I think that that's critical. And the only way to do that, well, I'm saying the only way to do that is to know as much as you can about the individual, to know as much as you can about why this individual is perform- producing or acting or performing in the manner in which they are. And that's what I've been dedicating my last 5 to 7 years of my life trying to figure out and provide some insight into.
Yeah. And I absolutely love what you just said because this is important. I am focusing with me being me. How can I gain the most, right, out in terms of a productivity that we now talk about, right, from the employees that I have? Or how can I bring the best, in other words, right, from the employees that I'm having in my team or team? And that is, I think, a very important focus and perspective or, focus, leadership focus. It's not the employees needs to adapt to me and who I am and what's my style. Yes, there is, of course, co-creation going on because we all need to adapt to each other. That's given. That's not one on the other. And at the same time, important is to have that lens of how can I bring the best out of the human being that I have in front of me. And yes, for that understanding, employees is so crucial. And what comes to me to ask at this moment, Neil, is why leaders need so many tests or the SCAR model that we will still dive into further. That why not to have just one-on-one conversation? Why leaders cannot get it out of one-on-one conversation? Because that could be a question that audience at this moment might be asking too themselves.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think that in certain organizations, smaller organizations where teams are small, that is a very viable solution. However, when a leader or an organization has hundreds or thousands of employees, it's much more difficult to get to that one-on-one to the level I believe is necessary to be able to be effective as a leader and to allow the employee to be effective as an employee. So you're not wrong that conversations should happen regardless, but it's very challenging for organizations of certain sizes to get to that level, knowing this kind of detail about their employees.
Yeah, and I can only picture also the next level. It's having this data somewhere, right? That's knowledge of the organization, knowledge about actually the most important asset in the organization, who are people. It also helps any developmental considerations, succession planning, and all of.
Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned it. So the model that I've created is data driven, right? So it needs to be. And to your point around having conversations, yeah, those are wonderful to have. And I would encourage leaders, managers to speak with their employees on a continual basis. I have one on ones with members of my team on a weekly basis in many cases, and every 2 weeks for others. So I would certainly encourage that. But again, that's more doable when you have a manageable number of people reporting to you. If you have 100 people reporting to you, difficult to have one-on-ones every week or even every 2 weeks or maybe even every month with these individuals. But it is data driven. And to your point, that is an important component because employee development is what this is all about. The model I've created is all about employee development. It isn't about trying to identify people that should be fired or moved out of their role. It's not about that at all. It's about employee development and trying to figure out how to get the most out of your employees. To circle back to the beginning where the CEO said to me and others, they need to get more out of their employees. That's the objective here. It's to figure out how to get more out of your employees by understanding why you're not. Those things that are hindering these employees from producing, at levels that the organization expects them to be producing at.
So, what kind of information a organization that is engaging you and using the data that comes from a CARS model, what can they expect or see, right? Like you come with a report. I know that there will be definitely several pages and angles, but from birth eye view, what are the things that they will be quickly able to identify thanks to using your model that maybe will take them so much more if they didn't, or maybe they will never come to these conclusions actually.
Yeah. So what's interesting is that organizations tend to spend, not all organizations, but many organizations tend to spend a lot of money on training. They tend to spend a lot of money in areas that they think the employees would benefit from, as opposed to understanding more about the employee so that they can focus the financial resources as well as the human resources more effectively and more efficiently. So the information that I provide allows them to understand of the 1,000 individuals within your organization, training will only really benefit 22% of these individuals based on what the data is showing, as opposed to an organization saying, okay, we've got this training. Everyone's going to get this training, whether they need it or not. So those cost savings, those effort savings, being more efficient is one of the outputs of this model and the information that I can provide. Leadership is another thing. Individuals may have all the skills that they need to produce effectively, but it's really around the leadership and the way in which leaders are engaging their employees. So in that instance, there may be zero cost or minimal cost involved in getting the employees to produce more. and meet those levels of expectations. So it's this kind of information that I believe organizations are yearning for, as opposed to just throwing dollars and money at a situation or what they perceive to be the problem when it really isn't the problem they should be focused on.
I can hear that important factor, right? Because it's definitely tailoring the solutions to the real problems, right? Addressing their where the problems are, first of all, which is what this model and process is bringing to the organizations, the awareness. And then also finding out, okay, so where do I need that training or maybe another measure, which helps HR and all leadership development and all employee and talent development teams to be more strategic and obviously efficient when it goes about budget spending as well, right? So I can see where that also plays. The question that has been also coming before already, I will put it now here, is like, what has surprised you in all this journey by, discovering these factors, creating this model and applying it also? I know that you have also put it in not only from theory to praxis, right? So what has most surprised you in all of this?
What surprised me is that I was right about organizations not really understanding the why around the situations with the employees. I had always posited that they weren't aware, but I always thought that there's got to be some level of awareness of the organizations. And it did actually surprise me in speaking with various C-level individuals across different organizations, across different industries, at how, unfortunately, of how misinformed they are around all of this. Again, it was something I thought might be the case, but I didn't really expect the organizations that I've been speaking with to be that dire in need of this information. Organizations can tell you very holistically, yeah, my company's employees, yep, they produce well, right? And holistically, they can be correct in saying that. If they've got 1,000 employees and 400 of them are producing as expected, and that's driving a lot of the performance of the organization, yeah, then they can say, yep, we're hitting our mark from a performance, from a revenue, from a financial perspective. But it's 400 individuals driving the 1,000 individuals within the firm. So they can holistically say that. But what they can't quantify is how much better off would we be if all 1,000 were producing at the levels we expect? So how can we get them to do this? That's the information that I'm looking to provide to these organizations to help them get to their goals and reach their objectives from a financial perspective, from a reputational perspective, ensure that the attrition rates of their employees is minimized. There's the right level of attrition or the right kind of attrition, and then there's the wrong kind of attrition. We're looking to help organizations minimize attrition of their employees so that everyone succeeds, right?
Yeah. And so I'm also hearing that your model and the data that you provide help leaders and organizations to identify the potential, the opportunities that they are maybe missing or probably missing. So that gives another leverage. And from your perspective, Neil, do you think that organizations cross board can actually say with confidence that they know how to measure productivity of employees?
No, organizations are going to tell you that they know how to measure productivity. I'm not claiming that they don't. As a matter of fact, I would venture to say that every organization has some manner in which they're able to produce some level of productivity or quantify it in some way. What I'm suggesting is they don't understand the why certain individuals, or a number of individuals are not producing. So if they can understand that, they can figure out ways in which, whether it's through developmental or employee development plans or leadership development plans or whatever the solution might be, that they can offer that to their employees that will foster greater productivity, greater revenue performance, greater, benefits to the organization. I'm not saying they can't and don't understand how to measure the productivity. Many do, some don't, but many already do and are measuring productivity. Again, it's one thing to say, based on our findings, we need to get more out of our employees. They're able to say that because they are measuring productivity at some level, but they can't explain why they're not getting more or how to get more out of their employees as a result of these questions or these variables that the employees inherently have that are preventing them from producing more.
Yep. So staying on a surface level data and statistics and trying to solve the problem on the surface, but not also on a deeper level, I think that's what I'm taking away from this. So how does it look like in practice when organizations work for you? They hire you for that. How long is the process and how the engagement look like?
Well, I like to say it's, a short-term process with long-term results. And by short-term, we're looking at anywhere, depending on the size and scope of the employees that are being measured, anywhere from 1 to 3 months. So there are larger organizations that do this kind of management consulting that spend 6 to 12, 18 months within organizations and drill down to various levels of detail. I think the interesting and attractive element of the model is that we look to get to these answers in 1 to 3 months, not 1 to 2 years, and provide an organization with that insight at a very detailed level very quickly.
Yeah, I can imagine that. No organization wants to wait for this kind of awareness, let me say, until very long because the change needs to happen so that we can turn as well those performance indicators and a whole sense of utilizing the potential of individuals. So going forwards, let me say the organizations would benefit in terms of employees' productivity, which is say this model that you have developed, and of course your awareness and your wisdom and expertise is for every type of organization. Is it for specific niche, for specific size as well?
Yeah, so, that's a very interesting question because I was on a call with someone recently, not trying to get them to use my model. This is someone I know outside that we chat quite a bit. And he said to me, if you're trying to be everything to everyone, then you're really not anything to anyone. So the model, while it is customizable, while it is fluid and able to integrate various things within it, I do not claim to be everything to everyone. I'm not looking to integrate this model into every type of industry there is. That would be irresponsible of me at the moment. But what I am focused on more so than others is corporate, right? So whether financial services or any other kind of corporation, whether it's advertising or publishing or whatever it might be, that it's those areas that I think might benefit from a corporate functional level. But again, not looking to be everything to everyone. But I think it's interesting to say that I met with a group company recently that are in the transportation industry. They're not necessarily interested in productivity as the output. They're interested in safety. And they wanted to use my model to determine whether or not they can gauge leadership capabilities along with propensity for safety and whether the model can take that in. And with a little bit of investigation into, well, what would that mean? Right? How would I change the inputs from conscientiousness and engagement and commitment to things like propensity for safety? And we have done that, and we are looking to, or they are now looking to integrate the model into their business, going out to transportation organizations to sell their service. So while I say I don't want to be everything to all, the model is dynamic enough to be able to be fluid, to bring in elements, to take out elements that would be custom to particular industries or organizations. The model in and of itself as it stands can't do that, right? Because the model as it stands takes in very specific variables, which we've discussed, employee needs and engagement and conscientiousness and et cetera. So that won't be fit for everyone. That won't be fit for purpose for everyone. But the model is dynamic enough to be custom to the needs of the organization, depending on what they're looking to gauge.
Okay, so I think what I'm hearing is, first of all, corporate focus. And you mentioned that before that it will serve larger organizations, not just small teams, right? Because certain degree smaller teams can cope with different ways of finding out. And this model is built for serving bigger amount of data and bigger or larger complexity. That's what I'm also hearing, right? Because large organization, more people, complex decision taking. So one of the last questions, Nil, today, apart from the model, apart from if companies work with you or not, just on the topic of employee productivity going forward, What is the most important factor? So, what is the most important things that organizations need to consider if they want to enhance employees' productivity and performance or another aspect?
Well, they need to understand the employee at levels that they don't currently understand them at today. We talked about leadership and contingency leadership, and I still believe that that drives employees to being productive and adding value to organizations. So I do think that organizations need to understand how to engage with their employees to understand a bit more about them, where to focus their efforts, where to focus their money that they will spend on understanding this and building up their employees, right? So this is again all about employee development plans and actionable items where, the employees can actually improve upon their value adding to the company. So I think that these are areas of importance, and it's driven from the organization and the information and the data that they have. One other thing that I think is interesting to note is while we're talking about individual employees here, another element of this is at the team level, right? So, for example, if an organization has a team that's in Dubai and they've got another team that's doing the same function in, Princeton, New Jersey, the comparison at the team level is as important as the comparison at the individual level. And what that tells the organization is, if we agree that there's a constant that the teams are made up of people with similar skills, similar experience, but the productivity is different, then is it regional? Is it leadership? That's the issue. Is it, any other number of factors that might be contributing to this? So, looking at as best organizations can, looking at this from a team level as well as an individual level is also pretty critical, and I think important for organizations to understand because at that level, it's not about skills, right, and it's not about the training. There could be, again, inherent reasons. For example, someone in Princeton, workers in Princeton, New Jersey, may have to travel an hour and a half to commute to work every day, where someone in Dubai might be traveling 15 minutes to get to work every day. I'm just making up these numbers, of course.
Yes,
But
people from the background will smile now because we usually take a bit longer, but it's okay.
okay, well, okay. But that in and of itself could be a factor that needs to be considered when we talk about productivity. So, regional kinds of things, and it's just very important for organizations to understand all of these components. It's not realistic for them to understand all of this all at once. What I'm trying to do is get them as much information as possible, but it's certainly not going to include every nuance of every element that they can be receiving data for or data on. That would be unrealistic. But giving them enough information to make the decisions that they need to make is what's important. And the reason I got involved in this element to begin with is to try to help organizations, right? So I believe I'm someone of integrity, and I try to do as best a job I can do and my work and the functions that I hold within organizations. And I just feel like it's important to try to give back, right? And yeah, I'm not a not-for-profit service, that's for sure. However, you know, it's a service that is extremely affordable to organizations. Not looking to break the bank of an organization, but give them this information. So, which is another element of ensuring that their costs are minimized, right? I don't want to be the reason, or my company to be the reason that an organization won't get to this level of understanding because it's cost prohibitive. So it is important to me to provide this insight to an organization so that they can benefit from it. And if I can benefit a little bit in doing this, then that's fantastic. But it is important to ensure costs are down, and we're maximizing the effort that we need to maximize while minimizing costs, minimizing the attrition of the employees, etc. So that's sort of my philosophy on this.
Yeah, I can see in how many boxes your and to reach challenges. It can help organizations overcome. Cost efficiency is, of course, a big topic, and not wasting the money on solutions that will not really bring even the solution. I think another thing you mentioned, obviously, the model will, my image is at least help organizations to identify where to dive deeper, because some of the aspects, like say leadership, they would need maybe to actually dive deeper in a part of the process of solutions, but at least there will be an identified commonality or threat into where to focus on, right, in this process, and in engaging the other experts into that. So yeah, thank you very much, Neil, for sharing about your mission, about your passion, something that comes, of course, your own experiences, and definitely something that is very close to your heart. And as someone that's a leader in your organization, I'm sure that it helps you also with that awareness leads in your own current role. And thank you very much for being and for exposing that. Is there anything else that you want to leave the listeners with from today?
Well, just the understanding of why is important, right? Each of us is, as an employee of an organization, have our little idiosyncratic things about us that push us forward or hinder us from moving forward. So getting to that why is, I think, critical. And that's really what I'm going to be dedicating a portion of my life to providing as best I can to organizations.
Thank you very much, Neil. I think that Simon Sinek will be smiling listening to you now with his why. In a different dimension. Well, thanks a lot once again. And thank you to all listeners as well to be with us today in this show. Neil, I guess that the best way to connect with you, if organizations listening to us today would like to take a contact with you, will be LinkedIn, which I'm pleased to put the link also in the description. Any other ways to connect with you, we'll always link it downstairs or in the description of the episode. And yeah, for listeners, it hopefully has been really an eye-opener for you, and I think an indication, because what I'm taking away is just one important message from Neil, is getting to know our employees better is helping our organization to be better. So thank you very much for listening today, and look forward to the next one.
Thank you very much, Dagmara. It was a pleasure. Appreciate it.